PETA already exposes how animals are tortured by researchers, but how are they treated before they get to the labs? The torture before the torture. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil, Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, the companies that fulfill scientists' torture addiction by supplying them with live animals. They're companies like Molten Chinchilla Ranch, Oak Hill Genetics, Ruby Fur Farm, and the Oakwood Research Facilities. If you've never heard of them before, well, that's intentional. They fly under the radar so they can do what they do, be the breeding factories of animals for experimentation. They breed animals and suffering in small, quiet towns like Ewing, Illinois, New Sharon, Iowa, Chatfield, Minnesota. But now PETA has obtained from the regulators themselves, the USDA, photographs and videos that document cruelty to animals. PETA Vice President Dr. Alka Chanda of the Laboratory Investigations Department exposes the horror behind the labs on the PETA Podcast. We know what animals go through in labs is bad, and we have a hard enough time convincing people that they should care about that. But then there's this whole other place where the animals, before they get to the labs, how they exist before they get to the labs, that people don't even think about.
That's right. And it's a really important part of the entire equation to see what happens in these facilities where animals are deliberately bred so that they can then be sold to laboratories. I think people care about what happens to animals in laboratories when you think about the torment and the caging and the unnatural conditions and the fact that it's anything goes and whatever the experimenter wants to do, they can do, without any pushback from the government, without any meaningful regulations to ensure some modicum of humane treatment. I think people care about that. But I think sometimes people will think, well, those are just, those are not invasive experiments, or they're not experiments where the animals are necessarily killed at the end. So maybe they're not so bad. And the thing that we want to, that we're exposing with this latest expose on animal suppliers is that, in fact, there's this other miserable world that people need to be aware of.
Yeah.
That's part and parcel of the whole industry.
Yeah, that's something that I don't think people even begin to think about, right? I mean, they'll think about what's going on in the labs, but that's enough of a horror that sometimes I would imagine the animal suppliers get overlooked.
That's exactly right, Emil. And, to be honest, we were quite shocked when we started looking at some of these facilities that breed animals. I go again to this is part and parcel of the big industry, because you can have really large corporations like Charles River Laboratories or Covance, and these are billion-dollar enterprises. And people will think, well, they're well-heeled, therefore, they must be doing some minimum. And that is absolutely false. When you go then and you look at the suppliers, you're talking about these ramshackle facilities. You're talking about animals being seen as inanimate widgets that are a means to the end, which is profit. And you see the manner in which these facilities, these supply companies, these vendors, cut corners, to the point that animals are not getting veterinary care. They're kept in ramshackle facilities. There's feces piling up. The cages are falling apart. There's mold everywhere. Animals are dying in the cages or falling through the cracks, literally falling through the cracks of the cages onto the floor where they might be run over by some truck.
Yeah.
And it's just a horror show.
When you think of it as, well, there's got to be a baseline, right? And if you establish maybe, it'd be pretty bad. But if 0 was the baseline, the actual way that animals are treated by these animal supply houses is less than 0. It's sub-0, which is, knowing how bad the baseline is, it's hard to believe that it could be worse than that.
Yeah, and I invite your listeners to come over to our website, PETA.org, and check out the feature. What we obtained were photographs and video footage from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That's the agency that's supposed to enforce the Animal Welfare Act. And these were photos and videos taken by inspectors with the USDA. And so when they go around to these facilities to ensure compliance, they will take videos and take photographs when there are violations that are very serious. And so that's what we obtained. And it's incredible.
Well, describe,
as you say, the less than 0, below the baseline.
Yeah. Well, describe some of these places, because on the website you name names, and once again, and it's important, you describe how these are USDA, this is USDA information, photographs taken by the inspectors. These are the regulators, and it's interesting to note, what did they do when they saw all this? But first, let's get to what they saw and what they documented. First of all, let's go to a place called Oak Hill, which is in Illinois. What did they find at Oak Hill Genetics in Southern Illinois?
Yeah, Oak Hill has long been on our radar because we would see these inspection reports, and they breed dogs and they breed pigs to then sell to laboratories. And what the inspectors documented is that there were feces-filled concrete stalls with no bedding, and there were lame, sick, and injured pigs who were suffering without veterinary care. The images that I found really disturbing, there were 6 infant pigs, just born, and they had infections that were so severe that their ears were filled with fluid. It almost looked not real. It was so bizarre. There was an older pig who was recumbent, and she couldn't get up. The whole time that the inspector was there, she wasn't able to get up. The inspector also documented wounds from the workers at this facility hitting the animals. When they want the pigs to go from one place to another, they just take out the canes and then they start hitting the pigs. And so there are these serious lacerations on the pigs' bodies. So, they're forced to basically exist in their own feces. The facilities are not being cleaned properly. The place is dilapidated. The animals who are injured are not being given veterinary care, and diseases are permitted to flourish through the facility. And so you get these, for example, baby pigs who have these fluid-filled ears from the infections.
Now, is this just a kind of an isolated thing within this particular facility, or is it like the entire facility is like this? I mean, 1 or 2, you might say, well, maybe they missed one, they can fix that. But is this widespread throughout the facility?
No, unfortunately, it is widespread throughout the facility. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 inspections. We're talking about multiple inspections over years that this has been permitted to go on. And the USDA will write up the facility, cite them in an inspection report. And then it's just business as usual, and then the USDA will cite the facility, come back the next year, cite it again. You see similar violations, come back the next year, cite it again. And, they're just skipping along, and then they might make an adjustment or two. But at the end of the day, it's that bottom line. They just don't care. And they know that if they're just cited, nothing's really going to happen.
So So it's like a traffic ticket in a way.
Yep, exactly.
And
yeah, a traffic ticket incurred by somebody who doesn't mind paying $100, $200 and, going on their way. And I'm not even saying that any of these facilities have been fined substantially. Basically it's a slap on the wrist.
But now most of these people, I mean, do they do this because they figured, well, these are animals that we're breeding that we're going to be experimented on anyway. Does it matter? Is that kind of the mindset, or is there anything?
I think they think it's the cost of doing business, that if they are just churning out these animals, repeatedly breeding them, so they just have so many babies coming out, that if some of the infants, some of the older animals, the females who are being repeatedly bred, if the conditions are so horrific that some die, well, that's okay, because in the larger equation, they're just breeding more and more. It's a numbers game for them. So none of these animals mean anything to the owners of the company or to the workers who are working there, because it's just an equation in a ledger sheet.
Yeah, but they do have to deliver a live specimen to the lab. I guess it doesn't have to be of great health. How many animals are we talking about here at, say, one facility like the one at Oak Hill Genetics?
Yeah, at Oak Hill Genetics, we're talking about hundreds of dogs and hundreds of pigs. It varies, of course, if the numbers fluctuate, but there we might be talking about in the neighborhood of 1,000 animals altogether. Some of the other facilities, that we exposed, we're talking thousands of animals. That's usually what it is.
Well, let's go to another one, because the Ruby Fur Farm is one. What can you tell us about Ruby Fur Farm?
They're in Iowa, and Ruby Fur Farm, as the name connotes, was once upon a time a farm where they would kill the animals who they were raising for the purpose of the clothing industry. They would kill the animals so that they could rip off the fur and then sell that to the quote unquote fashion industry. But they changed their business model so that now they sell the live animals to the experimentation industry. So we're talking about ferrets, raccoons, foxes, and skunks. And I think it's really shocking to people to hear that raccoons are used in laboratories, foxes are, ferrets are, skunks are. These are all animals who the experimenters somehow pull out from thin air, ways that they can exploit them and kill them in experiments.
Are we talking about a lot of animals here at this Ruby Fur Farm?
Yeah, again, we're talking about hundreds going into the low thousand numbers. And, we're talking about, just people can see the video at our website, but just to give the listeners sort of an image of what's going on, here we're talking about warehouses, many, many warehouses. So if people have seen factory farms, that's essentially what we're talking about. That's what this is. So here we have raised cages. These are wire cages. So wire all around you and on the, you're standing on wire. Right. So you have raccoons, for example, standing on wire for their entire lives, before either they die or they're killed or they're sold off to a laboratory. Those are the three choices an animal has. And it's really not their choice. It's a choice by the people who own the company. But they're in these suspended cages that are about 6 feet off the ground. And it's basically cage. As far as your eye can see and spanning across, it's under a roof. So you have a warehouse with all of these cages. So under one roof, you'll have hundreds of animals. They're all obviously defecating, urinating, and all of that goes onto the ground underneath. And what the inspectors documented was the feces piling up, feet of feces piling up underneath these suspended cages. So you can well imagine, this is not captured in the video footage or the photographs or the written word, but you can well imagine the stench. I mean, I would imagine that it's really difficult for somebody to go and visit there, and these animals live there. So you've got the feces, and because there's feces, you have all of these insects that come. There will be undigested food, and you're basically inviting various animals to come, whether you're talking about rats and mice coming in, and then, of course, a lot of insects. Then, because cleanliness is not the strong suit of Ruby Fur Farm, you're talking about water in the cages being covered with mold. And so the animals, if they're thirsty, which they're going to be when it gets really hot, they're forced to drink out of mold-filled containers. The cages were dilapidated with broken wires, so animals would get injured, because these cages are barely bigger than the bodies of the animals. It's like, imagine you're in a telephone booth, It's really hard to stay so still that you don't get hit by one of the sides of the telephone booth. And if there are protruding wires, you're going to get injured.
Well, Alka, do these animals get out? How long do they stay in this condition? And are they allowed to live any kind of life outside of the cage?
Oh, no. This is where they live, period. So if you're let's say a breeding raccoon, I should say a raccoon who is used to breed infants, to deliver offspring. If you're a raccoon who is put into that position, that's your entire life. Anyone who's familiar with puppy mills can imagine this. You think about the mother dog who is forced to deliver litter after litter after litter of puppies. She's there. That she's in that box for her entire life. And that's what's going on with the ferrets, the raccoons, the foxes, the skunks who are condemned to be breeders. That's where they are for their entire lives. And for as long as any of the other animals are at the facility, they're in those suspended wire cages. They're not going out anywhere. There's no playtime. There's no time to allow your feet to get a rest from the wire. You think about this, raccoons, they're not tiny animals.
Yeah.
And you're living on that wire. That wire goes into your paws, and you can get seriously injured. It hurts to stand on that.
Alka, then, so they stay in these cages. There's all this, all the feces around them. It's not sanitary. How is it in terms of disease? And do these animals get sick? Do they get veterinary care?
Yeah, they absolutely get sick. And at another facility that we profiled in our expose, Molten Chinchilla Ranch. I mean, these names are absurd. So Molten Chinchilla Ranch looks a lot like Ruby Fur Farm in the sense that you have the suspended cages, they're made out of wire, the chinchillas are standing on wire for their entire lives. And yes, your point is exactly correct, Emil, that, if an infection goes through, if because of the fecal conditions, the insects that are teeming through and running through the whole facility, the mold, all of this, if you get, like, as a result of that, a virus or a bacteria going through, it goes through everybody.
But they don't, it's not a matter of course. I mean, veterinary care is not a priority, I would imagine. Or is it?
No, it's absolutely not a priority. And to think about Molten Chinchilla Ranch, and that, by the way, is up in Minnesota, just outside of Rochester. Right. The federal inspectors there found chinchillas with open, untreated wounds, collars that had embedded into their necks. There were many animals who had their eyes crusted over because of the infection. So they would get the infection in their eyes. Many of them couldn't open either eye. I mean, it's just quite shocking. But then again, it becomes this issue of it's the cost of doing business. For them, the cost of conducting business is, okay, there are going to be these animals who are not saleable. You won't be able to sell them because they're sick. There are going to be a lot of animals who die, but so what? Because the chinchillas are, the female chinchillas who are being used for breeding are pumping out these babies. And, some of them die. You sell the others.
Yeah.
It's just the way it goes.
And, a lot of these places are in really just remote areas, population 300. It's almost as if they are looking for these small places where this can sort of exist out in the open, but in these desolate, remote type of places, so as to not feel the, I guess, the either the concern nor the wrath of people who might look at these operations and say something's wrong here.
Yeah, it's like any kind of factory farming where, factory farms exist in rural areas away from prying eyes. And usually they're located next to people who, may not have the resources to raise a stink. And it's funny to say raise a stink when these places are, the inspectors talk about the putrid odor that comes off of the animals and, comes out of the facilities, comes off the animals because they're sick, comes out of the facilities because the feces. And it's like puppy mills, all of the puppy mills in Missouri, all in rural areas away from ears that will hear the animals who are, yelping, crying out because they're suffering so terribly. And I think that's by design. Yeah.
And there's one other farm, or they're not really farms, they're research facilities is what they're called. There's a place in Michigan, outside of a small town called Oxford, Michigan, the Oakwood Research Facility. And there's like 4,000 white domestic rabbits there. Tell me about Oakwood and what they do. How bad is it there?
Emil, the photos from Oakwood were just outrageous. You have these rabbits, and again, same deal. You've got the suspended cages, so cages off the floor, wire flooring. So dilapidated, there are pictures taken by the USDA inspectors of rabbits in these cages just slightly bigger than their bodies. I mean, you talk about confinement, the sense of claustrophobia would be huge. But then the cages are falling in on the rabbits. They're so misshapen. And so you have rabbits who are not in rectangles, but rabbits who are in these almost rhomboids, where the sides are basically collapsing. Think about being, again, in that telephone booth and the sides are collapsing in on you. Yeah. So you started in a tiny space and it's become even tinier. And again, there are jutting wires and things like that are going to injure the animals. But yeah, 4,000 rabbits. There is no way you're going to be able to care for that many animals in any way that anyone would consider acceptable.
The way you describe the cages, it makes it sound not like a cage, which would be like a quote unquote home. It sounds more like a trap because they're being Absolutely. Held at bay. This is their life. Until they go to the labs or until they're sold. How long do they have to live in these conditions before they're sold?
Yeah, it varies. And, if you look at, it's hard to get cost figures, but I was looking earlier at, somebody leaked to us, somebody who cares about animals leaked to us I hate to use the word catalog, but that's what it is. It's a catalog. And this was from a company called Covance, a catalog of animals you could purchase from Covance. And the price depends on the age of the animal. So, if I'm an experimenter somewhere, I might say, I'm going to do blah, blah, blah experiment. I want rabbits who are 6 months old, or maybe I want rabbits who are newborn. And the cost will depend on that. So to answer your question, Emil, there are experimenters who will want dogs who are 2 years old. And so that means that those dogs are going to be held at Oak Hill until they're 2 years old. But then maybe there's an experimenter who wants puppies.
So they're there. They can be there for varied lengths. But bottom line is there's a market for them. Who are these people who are buying from these suppliers? And why are they? I guess they're keeping them in business because the research demand is there, right? So they have to go to the suppliers. Is who exactly is it? Is it commercial? Is it are they university type researchers? Who are the
Yep,
researchers?
all of the above, and also government facilities. So, some of the ferrets from these facilities are being purchased by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The National Institutes of Health has purchased from these facilities. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has purchased from these facilities. Universities, as you mentioned, also sometimes commercial laboratories. I believe I saw that Charles River Laboratories has purchased rabbits from Oakwood Research Facility. So you're talking about basically everybody. And, the thing is, Emil, culpability is across the board. Yeah. It's like the two-bit, quote unquote, business person, running these ramshackle facilities and giving the animals absolutely nothing, basically pumping them out, treating them like disposable objects, treating them like inanimate widgets, and then selling their bodies. So if you're CDC and, you think you're so elite, or you have these shiny laboratories, whatever it is, once you're purchasing from any of these facilities, there is a taint in what you're doing. I mean, not only because of the horrible and worthless experiments that you're doing, but you are part of creating that demand that results in these horrific facilities.
Well, so you think there should be some kind of responsibility on the part of the buyers on how the suppliers treat the animals, even though the buyers aren't going to do anything more to the animals except torture them. What's their responsibility, you think?
Their responsibility is huge. I mean, the ask that we always have to customers of these sorts of companies is look for better ways. Stop using animals. The data is abundantly clear that using animals does not advance our scientific knowledge. It hasn't helped treat human disease. There is so much data around that, 95% failure rate if you're talking about testing pharmaceutical drugs and whether they're safe and effective for human beings. 90% of basic research, much of which involves animals, never translates to clinical findings for human beings, treatments or cures. So our first ask is use human relevant methodologies to do your research. Just stop using animals. But if you're going to, we don't really phrase it this way, but the idea is if you're going to use animals, don't be supporting these. This company, you have to realize that there's a culpability. So before we started focusing on these 4 companies that we've talked about, we had secured some video footage and photos from the USDA of a dog breeding facility, which is in Cumberland, Virginia. And at this dog breeding facility, which had been owned by Covance and is now owned by Envigo, we saw that dogs were being bred in horrific conditions, ramshackle cages. The dogs were not socialized. They were frantic. There were dogs, with tumors on their mammary glands, the size of an orange. There were dogs who had open wounds on their bodies, weren't given veterinary care. That particular facility has thousands of dogs. And there's just no way to care for them properly. If I'm Virginia Tech now, the university, and I'm buying dogs from what is now Envigo, there is culpability with me on giving my money, $700 for a dog, to this deplorable company that can't even give veterinary care to the dogs.
Well, how about their science? I mean, if they don't care about care because they figure, well, we're going to torture them anyway, should they care, or is there any way that how these animals are treated, especially on psychological or behavioral type of studies they might do, would that impact the science that the researchers do?
You're absolutely correct, Emil, and that's a really important consideration, because if there are obviously the psychology experiments, because these are animals who've been traumatized, by the way in which they've been bred and raised and caged. So there's going to be that dimension. And then on top of that, we know that when there's trauma that impacts, metabolism, immunological issues, a whole host of issues. And so those are considerations as well. These are animals who've been traumatized, and therefore they're going to have all of these issues. That's going to be background in any kind of work, even not psychological, but physiological work that's being done. If you're looking at immunology experiments, that the fact that these animals were raised in such deplorable conditions is going to have an impact on that.
So bad supply houses or bad supply centers could equal bad data. You got to chuck it all and start over and maybe begin without the animals.
Exactly. I mean, that's really, the best science anyway, is to do human relevant, sophisticated, modern research using such things as organs on chips or bioinformatics, or, we like to point out that the entire human genetic map is now on the internet. If we have that kind of data, you put the power of supercomputing over all of the databases that we have on how we respond to different chemicals. I mean, the power of that is so great, and you're getting human relevant data. Animal experimentation is a holdover, from centuries past, and it stems, as I'm sure you and many of your listeners well know, it stems from when there were religious prohibitions on, for example, dissecting a human cadaver, and so right from the early days, we're talking centuries and centuries ago, rather than understanding human physiology, human anatomy by looking at human cadavers, because there was a prohibition on that, there were people who were cutting up animals. And, there were textbooks, anatomy textbooks, that were based on the anatomy of guinea pigs and dogs and cats and, monkeys. It's just so absurd. It's this holdover, this antiquated notion that we can somehow apply data from these other animals to the human animal. It's scientifically flawed and, of course, absolutely unethical.
So, Alka, if PETA were to end the supply, these 4 supply centers, how many animals do you think would be saved? How much money do you think is generated from all this in terms of really wasted activity? Because the science isn't any good, but they're able to profit on the bad science. What kind of dollars? How many animals are we talking about?
If we just focus on the 4 facilities that we were looking at, and these are the facilities for which we receive photos and video footage from the USDA, you're probably talking about tens of thousands of animals. But this is actually a small part of a much bigger issue. I referred to the thousands of dogs at what is now in Vigo. So that was sort of a separate matter that we looked at and that we're still campaigning around. And we have video and photos on our website. Some years ago in 2011, we went public with an investigation that we did of a place called Triple F Farms. And again, the word farms, but what it is really is, again, a set of warehouses out in rural Pennsylvania where they breed ferrets to then sell to laboratories and also to actually, strangely, to the companion animal industry. But the issues that we've been discussing, Emil, lack of veterinary care, the suspended cages made out of wire, baby ferrets were falling through the wire holes, and the trucks that would go through to, clean up, they would just routinely drive over these baby ferrets, or the baby ferrets would just, drown in the feces that had piled up, or they would, die of starvation or thirst.
So in terms of a dollar amount, though, because this is all being done because it's business. What kind of business is the animal supply industry generating?
It's in the billions. Yeah. We don't have authoritative figures or specific figures from these different places because they are private industries. But when you think about like the Charles Rivers of the world, Charles River Laboratories, that's based in Massachusetts, supplies 1 out of every 2 animals in laboratories worldwide. When you think about places like Jackson Laboratory, which is in Bar Harbor, Maine, and they also have a facility in Sacramento, and this is a place that breeds mice and rats to sell to laboratories, including genetically modified mice and rats. So mice who are genetically predisposed to being obese or being, having symptoms that look like some kind of neurological disease or being predisposed to being depressed or whatever it might be. When you add that, you're talking billions of dollars.
All right. So a massive, massive problem that people don't even think about when they're just looking at the experiments. They don't look at the suppliers. The experiments are bad. The suppliers and how they treat the animals and the amount of money they make off that mistreatment and cruelty, even greater than people think. What can listeners do? What can viewers do about this issue? What do you subscribe?
Yeah, we ask people to come over to our website, because a big part of it is getting others to understand. So come check out the page that we have devoted to this on our website. You can see the video, you can see photos. And again, these are videos and photos that were taken by USDA inspectors. You'll see that we have a petition there because we are calling on the USDA to basically cancel the licenses of these facilities. They've shown that they cannot, either they cannot or they will not, or they're not interested in abiding by the very minimal animal welfare standards that exist in the regulations. They just can't do it, or they're not able to do it, or they don't want to do it. It's one of those things. But in any case, whatever it is, the fact is that the laws that exist in the Animal Welfare Act, these regulations, the standards, they reflect what the American population expects. That if animals are going to be bred, to be sold to laboratories, there are certain standards, and that means they have to be given veterinary care. They can't be drinking water out of like a container that contains mold. They can't be forced to exist on wire cages where their feet are being injured and they're not getting veterinary care. They can't be forced to exist in cages where there are feet of feces built up underneath and they have to inhale this, all day long.
So, Alka, should people who want to see this end, what should they be asking for? That the USDA come out with stronger rules or adhere to rules, make them harder, or should this practice of supplying animals and hence the research with animals end?
What we're asking the USDA to do is to yank the licenses, because if the USDA took away the licenses for these companies to operate their facilities, that would mean that those facilities would have to fold. They couldn't continue carrying out their business. And that has ramifications for the larger industry, in the sense that means that other companies will see that this will not be tolerated. I'll be the first to admit that the standards are not enough. It's hardly, crossing a reasonable bar to say, oh, you have to give veterinary care to sick or injured animals. I mean, that's the lowest of the low bar, but these facilities aren't doing that. And so if the USDA yanks the license, it sends the message to everybody that at the very least they have to do this. And hopefully that means that fewer bad actors will be drawn into this business, thinking they can make a quick buck off the back and off the suffering of vulnerable animals. So that's the start. And what we're hoping is that as animals become less available, that the experimentation industry starts taking seriously the fact that using animals doesn't help anybody, and what they need to do is switch to a better way.
Yeah, and Alka, once again, where can listeners go? PETA.org, or what website should they go to see this story about what what PETA is exposed at the animal supplier level?
Yeah, people can head over to PETA.org/supply, and that will take them to our website. So that's PETA.org/supply, and that will take us over to the headlines page.
All right. Well, Dr. Alka Chanda, thank you very much for letting us know about what PETA has exposed. I really appreciate you being on the program, Alka. Let's hope that people see what's going on at the animal supplier level and hope that even spurs a greater call to end any research at the laboratory and research level.
Thank you so much, Emil. It was a pleasure as always.
Dr. Alka Chanda, PETA Vice President on Laboratory Investigations, on the cruelty of the animal supply companies that should now be on your radar. Go to PETA.org for more. And that's our show this time out. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on amok.com, AMOK.com, or see my work at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, that's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.